Today on Psycast, we're going to talk about something that most of us feel, quietly and too often, the sense that we are somehow less interesting, less remarkable, or less worthy than others. Let me ask you something. How often do you sit in a room full of people and feel like you have nothing that special to say? Like your life is too ordinary, your thoughts too scattered, your experiences too small to matter? Maybe you scroll through social media, listen to others tell stories, or even sit across from someone you admire, and something inside you whispers, they're more interesting than I am. And worse, I don't have much to offer. It's a quiet voice, one that doesn't scream, but lingers. You don't tell anyone about it because it sounds too fragile, too self-centered to admit. But that belief that you are somehow less interesting, less full of color or meaning, is more common than you think. And it's more untrue than you know. You see, we tend to underestimate ourselves not because we lack depth, but because we are too close to our own story. When you live inside something every day, it begins to look plain. We normalize our own pain, our small triumphs, our peculiar ways of thinking. What is fascinating to others feels obvious to us because we carry it daily. So we start to believe that if it doesn't shock or sparkle, it must not be worth much. But that's not how interest works. That's not how meaning is measured. Søren Kierkegaard once wrote, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." He believed that most of us don't really know the weight of our own journey until we step back from it. That we live our lives forwards, in the mess of it, the confusion, the ordinary, but we only begin to understand its richness when we reflect. And the tragedy is, many people never stop long enough to look back and realize just how profound their path has been. You might think you've done nothing extraordinary, but I promise you this. If someone else lived your life for a week with your thoughts, your memories, your fears, and your strength, they would be moved. They would notice what you don't. The quiet resilience. The way you kept going when no one saw. The strange, beautiful way your mind connects things. The softness you carry, even after all the hardness you've endured. There's a concept in psychology called the false consensus effect. It means we tend to assume that what we think, feel, or experience is common, more common than it actually is. So we diminish our uniqueness. We assume our inner world is ordinary because it feels familiar to us. But what you carry inside you, your exact way of seeing the world, your humor, your memories, your inner language, is unlike anyone else's. Just because it's yours doesn't mean it's simple. We are terrible judges of our own depth. We compare our behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel, and then decide we fall short. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if the things you've dismissed as boring are actually the most fascinating parts of you? What if the way you learned to survive, to love, to stay soft in a hard world, that's what makes you captivating? Let me tell you something I once heard, and it stayed with me. The person you're trying to become is already quietly alive in you. You don't have to manufacture a more interesting self. You don't have to pretend to be deeper than you are. You just have to stop running from the quiet truth of who you already are. Because that self, it's already enough. It's already layered, strange, poetic, and compelling. There's something quietly devastating about the way we measure ourselves through the eyes of others. We begin to believe that our worth is only real when someone else confirms it, when they laugh at our stories, respond to our thoughts, or show interest in our lives. And when they don't, or when we imagine they wouldn't, we turn inward and shrink. We start editing ourselves before we even speak. We withhold opinions, silence curiosities, and trade authenticity for acceptability. Not because we're dishonest, but because we're scared that if people saw the full, unfiltered version of us, they'd find it underwhelming. But here's the hidden cost of that fear. The more you try to be palatable, the more invisible you become. And slowly, without noticing, you start to believe in your own invisibility. That's where the underestimation begins. Not from the world, but from within. You begin to believe that your presence is neutral, that if you vanished from a conversation, the air wouldn't shift, that your thoughts are echoes, not original, that your story doesn't quite earn the space it takes. But I need you to hear something. Being interesting isn't about being loud, dramatic, or always having something clever to say. It's about being fully present in your own truth. It's about bringing your particular way of seeing, your specific language of feeling, into the world, without shrinking it to fit someone else's mold. Carl Jung once wrote about the individuation process, the journey of becoming fully yourself, of embracing all the contradictions and shadows and strangeness that make you who you are. He believed that each person holds within them a kind of internal blueprint, a unique psychological fingerprint, and to ignore it, to suppress it, is to live half a life. Jung didn't say we must become like others. He said we must become ourselves, more fully and more courageously. Think about this. When was the last time you let yourself speak without adjusting your words mid-sentence to seem smarter, kinder, less intense, more normal? When was the last time you told a story and didn't soften its edge for fear of sounding too emotional? Or asked a question that was actually on your mind instead of the one that felt socially safe? The truth is, the people we find most magnetic are often not the ones who try to impress, but the ones who are simply unapologetically themselves. There's something captivating about someone who isn't performing, who doesn't constantly try to manage how they're perceived, who can sit with their own contradictions and still speak with presence. So maybe the real question isn't, how can I be more interesting? Maybe the better question is, what parts of myself have I silenced out of fear that they were too much or not enough? Because often, those are the very parts that carry our deepest beauty. The wild parts, the quiet parts, the broken parts, the parts that didn't fit into any box but never stopped trying to speak. You underestimate yourself, not because you're lacking, but because you've spent so long translating yourself into a language that isn't your own. You've been fluent in self-editing. And maybe now, you're just tired of hiding the most textured parts of your being. If that's true, then good. Because the moment you stop trying to be enough for everyone else is the moment you begin to come home to yourself. There's a strange thing that happens when we start to accept the version of ourselves that others reflect back to us. If we're constantly told we're quiet, we begin to believe we have nothing to say. If we're overlooked in a room, we begin to shrink in every room. If someone important once made us feel dull, invisible, or too complicated to love, that feeling lingers, not just as a memory, but as an identity. And over time, we stop exploring who we really are. We settle into the idea that our story isn't worth telling because it wasn't received with care when we first tried to tell it. But identity isn't fixed. It's a living thing. It shifts and expands based on where we are willing to look. If you only ever look at yourself through the eyes of those who didn't really see you, of course, you'll feel like you're not enough. But if you could look at yourself through the eyes of someone who truly understood, who saw not just what you said, but what you meant, not just how you moved, but what you were carrying, you would be stunned by how much is there. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, once said, "What is to give light must endure burning." He wasn't glorifying suffering. He was pointing to something deeper, that the very parts of us we tend to hide, the ones shaped by pain, confusion, silence, are often the sources of our light. But we have to stop burying them in shame. We have to stop assuming that what we've survived somehow makes us less worthy of connection, when in fact, it's the reason we're capable of such deep empathy and presence. You are not boring. You are layered. You've lived through things you still don't have the words for. You've made choices you can't fully explain. You've loved people who didn't know how to hold that love. You've stayed silent in moments that haunted you. That complexity, that contradiction, it's not something to be smoothed over. It's something to be honored. But here's the challenge. In a world that prizes certainty and clarity, how do we make peace with the parts of ourselves that are still becoming? How do we stay curious about who we are instead of deciding too early that we're already figured out and lacking? Maybe we begin by noticing the subtle moments when we quiet ourselves unnecessarily. When we hesitate to share something that moved us or downplay a thought we find beautiful. Maybe we start listening to those quiet sparks, the ideas that come when we're alone, the questions that don't go away. Because those things, that's your inner life trying to reach you. That's the truth of who you are, tapping gently to be let in. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth." In other words, you can't see your full self from the inside, and you don't need to. What you can do is allow more of yourself to come forward, without judgment, without constantly asking if it's interesting enough. When you stop needing to be impressive, you become real. And there's nothing more magnetic than someone who's quietly at peace with their own mystery. Sometimes I wonder how many versions of ourselves we've left behind just because someone didn't understand them. How many ideas we stopped exploring. How many feelings we swallowed. How many versions of us never got to grow because we were waiting for permission, waiting for someone to say, "Yes, that part of you is good. That part is welcome." But the truth is, no one can give you that permission. At some point, you have to give it to yourself. We underestimate ourselves because we confuse rejection with truth. If someone once ignored us, we think we must have been unworthy of attention. If someone once walked away, we believe we weren't enough to stay for. But what if rejection says more about the other person's capacity to receive than it does about our value? What if your inner world wasn't too much, but simply misread by someone who never learned how to see deeply? This is why self-trust is so hard, because it means holding your ground even when others don't echo your worth back to you. It means staying with yourself, especially when the world is quiet. And that's not easy. Especially if you grew up learning to survive by pleasing, adapting, anticipating other people's needs. In those cases, self-expression can feel dangerous, like a risk you're not sure will be worth it. So you protect yourself by staying small, by being agreeable, by not taking up too much space. But here's the paradox. The more you erase yourself to be accepted, the less accepted you actually feel. Because deep down, you know it's not really you being loved. It's a version of you you've curated for approval. And there's nothing lonelier than being liked for a self that isn't fully yours. So what's the way out? It begins, I think, with curiosity. Not self-improvement, not some project to become more interesting or impressive, but a quiet return to your own presence. What happens if you stop performing? What do you think about when you're not trying to sound smart? What makes your chest ache in that beautiful, honest way when no one's watching? James Clear, in his work on identity and behavior, says something simple but profound. Every action you take is a vote for the kind of person you want to become. This isn't about perfection. It's about small, consistent gestures of self-trust. Speaking up in a conversation when you usually hold back. Writing down a thought that feels silly, but keeps coming back. Wearing something that feels more you, even if it's not what others expect. These aren't grand revolutions. They're quiet rebellions. Little ways of saying, I believe there is something worth showing here, even if it's still forming, even if it's not fully understood. And slowly, that begins to change the story. You stop waiting to be discovered. You start discovering yourself. And you begin to realize that being interesting was never about being the loudest or most articulate person in the room. It was always about being the most present, the most real, the most willing to let your soul be seen, even in the subtleties. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from feeling like no one really knows you. Like you've walked through life performing fragments, adapting to every space you enter, slowly disconnecting from the center of yourself. And after a while, even you begin to forget what that center feels like. You look in the mirror and see a reflection that looks familiar, but doesn't quite feel like home. That's the cost of chronic self-abandonment. It wears down your sense of aliveness. You become efficient, likable, adaptable, but distant from your own inner pulse. And when that happens, it's easy to believe that you're not all that interesting. But here's the painful irony. The parts you've hidden the most are often the parts that would make someone feel most connected to you. The ones you thought were too strange, too sensitive, too tender. They're the very parts that create intimacy. That allows someone to say, me too. Maybe no one told you this before, but what you've lived, especially the quiet, unspoken things, deserve to be named. You don't have to make them dramatic or polished. You don't have to turn them into a performance. You just have to tell the truth, softly, And let the truth breathe, because someone, somewhere, is carrying a story so close to yours they don't have words for it yet. And when they hear yours, it will feel like being seen for the first time. This is what Søren Kierkegaard meant, in a way, when he spoke about despair, not as a dramatic sorrow, but as being disconnected from oneself. He said, "The greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all." That line always stayed with me, because we imagine loss of self as something loud, something tragic. But more often, it happens in soft ways, by small compromises, small silences, small acts of pretending. Until one day, we wake up and realize we've been living beside ourselves, not as ourselves. But here's the hope inside all of this. If you can lose yourself quietly, you can also return to yourself quietly. Not with a dramatic overhaul, but with a slow, steady remembering. Remembering what lights you up, what questions feel alive in you, what textures, words, stories, or places make you feel like more of yourself. This is not about reinvention. It's about reunion, not becoming someone new, but coming back to someone ancient inside you, someone who was never gone, only buried. You don't have to prove your worth through performance. You don't have to be dazzling to be valuable. Your quiet wonder, your way of noticing, your strange little metaphors, those are your gold. Not everyone will see it, but the right people will, and more importantly, you will. And that changes everything. Because once you start seeing yourself clearly, the whole world softens. You stop trying so hard to be seen. You start offering yourself as you are. And that perhaps is the most interesting thing you could ever do.